Hey there everyone, I am here to do a little demo on acrylic painting. So I'm just going to start with some of the basics on how I start to build up transparent layers through the use of acrylic paint. This is a process that I also do with oils, but acrylic is a little bit easier to manage at home, so I thought I would start with that. So you can see kind of the process of how I build up the work to create some really unique looking layers and really rich depth color with the work. So I hope you'll enjoy the process and try it along with me. So in starting a new painting, nothing can be more intimidating than a big white blank canvas staring you down. So a blank canvas can be quite intimidating. So the best way to begin is with what I call an underpainting. So in painting, an underpainting is a first layer of paint applied to a canvas or board, and it functions as a base for other layers of paint. It acts as a foundation for your painting and is a great way to start your painting off with, some built-in contrast and tonal values. So it's a technique that was widely used by the old masters, and also as a way to develop a plan for future color placement and to establish certain values and tones within, a painting's color palette. Underpainting, if it's used correctly, is a great way to unite colors in the overall painting and add, a subjective color key to the painting that will create a tonal base for it. So underpainting is simple, and it can have major effects on the rest of your painting to help it to become very beautiful and full of rich depths and color. So what I'm demonstrating here are the steps in the process of creating an underpainting utilizing acrylic paint. In many ways, this process is like beginning a drawing, but with the use of paint. So there is no need to use pencils or drawing tools at all in order to make a painting. So it's just as easy to draw with paint. So that's my rule. Always begin the piece straight away with paint. No pencil, no charcoal. Use just one color to begin with, along with perhaps a little white in case you make a mistake or need to sort something out as you begin. Do a quick gesture painting in paint, of your subject matter and fill up that intimidating space as quickly as possible. So I begin with a single color, and here you see me using Prussian blue, using a golden heavy body acrylics. Those are actually my favorite for acrylic painting. And then after the gesture, start to map out, your darker and lighter areas through what is sometimes referred to as a tonal underpainting. That's what you see me working on here. So this semester I've been teaching a class to painting students called Concepts in Painting and Drawing, and the focus or topic of the course changes each semester. And so this semester we're working on narrative and pop culture. And so with this assignment that we've actually been working on, I've asked students to appropriate a film still of their choosing. Could be from something current or something from the past, and this is what you see me painting from here in this image. And I just thought it'd be interesting in terms of a basis where I'm mapping out the underpainting, and then the students are asked to sort of transform that film still into something, of their own invention, to change it or make it their own in some way. And so in order to do that, it actually still works quite well to create an underpainting of that original film still to give it that kind of unifying ground and that unifying basis in what this sort of original, source image was, even though you might completely change it into something else. So I just wanted to give you that background information to begin with. So you saw me working with just one paint color at a time, and the paint color that I'm using is called Prussian Blue Hue. I wanted to explain the term hue after that paint color name because that is actually super important to something to know about with regards to your paint colors. So some colors, traditionally use a specific pigment. So there might be like cobalt blue, for example. This is a certain cobalt compound that it's made out of, which actually makes it quite a bit more expensive. So for reasons of cost, toxicity, or whatever, a manufacturer might, make a substitute color which has about the same hue, but which does not use the traditional pigment. In order to indicate this, they use that word hue after the color name. So you might see a paint tube that says cobalt blue hue, it would look similar to the original cobalt blue, but would be made from a substitute, usually less expensive pigment. So that's important to remind yourself of. Like if I'm using Prussian blue hue, it's not really Prussian blue. It's just a mixture that's made to look like it. So in essence, it's probably a little bit less intense in terms of color, a little bit less pigment content, and cheaper. So it might contain more fillers, and you might run out of that paint a little bit more quickly than that original color pigment. So when working on an underpainting, it's important to, start to establish that composition, start to develop values, a sense of scale and contrast. Make sure that you're measuring and doing your proportion and scale correctly. So, when I teach drawing, it's always starting with a gesture, getting something down quickly, and then using that energy to then transform it into something that is correct in terms of proportion and scale. So what you do to utilize, one element that you can measure over to another. Like in this painting, I might be comparing that larger figure to the smaller ones behind it. Where's the bend in the elbow compared to the head on this other figure? Or where are the other three small heads, in relation to one another, as well as the objects next to them. So those measurements are super important at this stage, and so that oftentimes makes the underpainting stage actually a little bit more difficult or taxing mentally, because you're just really working hard to get it right and try to establish values and also tones. Because if you don't put in the time necessary at this stage in the game, you're going to regret it later when you're going to have to really completely change your painting when you see something's wrong. So it's super important to utilize just that one color, keep it simple, use a lot of washes, a lot of water, particularly with acrylics, so that you're able to manipulate that composition, transform it, get your measurements down, and get it right. And just keep comparing one object to another across the composition, and eventually it'll come into greater and greater detail. But at this stage, you're looking for those larger shapes of light and dark until you get the composition fully established. But again, just always, try to keep your paintbrush as wet as possible with acrylic. You know that things dry quickly. Here in this sort of drier climate where I'm at, things do dry very quickly. So I always have that water right next to me. I also have often my hands full of 2 or 3 or 4 different paintbrushes. So switching out the scale of your mark making is also important to create a sense of variety, and it also really helps to get some texture and depth and interest into that work early on in this painting. So one thing that you'll notice with acrylics is that the color itself dries a shade darker than you might expect. So this is something that you get used to over time. Basically what happens is that when you lay the acrylic paint down, it's wet, and actually the water itself creates a lightness, and so you have to be patient as it dries and just kind of be in tune with the fact that it's going to be a little bit darker than you might imagine. So to accommodate this issue, I often use a wet brush and then a dry brush on the side, and I'll lay the paint down with the wet brush and then kind of fan it out with the dry brush until I see it kind of settle into place. Because that way then I can know for sure exactly how it's going to look in the end. And I also have to work fairly quickly, right? So my goal is to, get those transparencies in there, to get a sense of space with this underpainting, and work thin and quickly with a lot of moisture with water. So here you see me diving into the second layer. So a good way to start this process, if you're not used to it, is to really just mix up one color at a time. So on my palette you see, the blue that I used for the first layer is still sort of there. I have white, and then I mixed up a color which is kind of a dark red with some brown added to it, and then I put on a pile of medium. So what I want to do is build this painting up in transparent layers. And even though I'm using only one color at a time, you're going to see other kind of colors form as I'm using that transparent color on top of the color that I have underneath. And this is what creates really a beautiful painting. You know, acrylic can be somewhat difficult to work with in terms of its drying time and the fact that, you know, if you use really heavy, thick acrylic, it can look like plastic. Those are things that I don't necessarily like too much in terms of my own process. I often use oils. But this is the way I actually build up an oil paint as well. So, you know, if you can use acrylic, which is obviously non-toxic, and give it the quality of what an oil paint kind of does, you know, that's, you know, mastering a medium in a certain way. So I think you'll find that this process is really fun, building up these transparent layers and seeing what kind of colors can come out. Because once you've got past that sort of more complicated underpainting stage, you've mapped out all your proportions and scale correctly, then you can start having fun. You know, color is the great thing about painting. I love color. And so this is the great time where, you know, I can start to develop that piece, give it a lot more depth, and really start to transform the image. So the other thing about your color is that, you know, not every single kind of paint color is the same. You know, you have to look for a quality paint brand, not just student grade paints. You should really start with artist grade paints. I find that student grade paints are really just kind of wasting your money because they contain fillers, and they might seem like they're bigger or bulk as large a tube as an artist grade paint, but when it actually dries, those fillers kind of evaporate and disappears, and so you end up with like a lesser paint film than you do if you're using an artist grade paint. Also, the color isn't as strong and isn't as good because it contains those fillers. So like I said, golden is kind of my favorite for acrylic. So they offer really excellent permanency and light fastness. There's no fillers or extenders or toners or dyes added. And so you're going to get nice, strong, vivid color and also heavy body paint at the same time. So there are a lot of ways to deal with acrylic paint, and so just keep in mind that this is one method and a method that I like and really helps to produce some really beautiful, unique results with your color using transparencies. So the medium that I'm using is an acrylic matte medium. It's a fluid medium, which is helpful. I mean, I know there's a lot of other kinds of mediums you can get out there, and there'll be other demos that I do where I demonstrate other kinds of processes using acrylic because it is so versatile and there's so much that you can do with it. So as you're observing this process, there are some really interesting things about the history of acrylic actually. So, as you know, painting is a really fantastic form of art. And while some of the oldest methods really date back 1,000 years, acrylic painting is actually a relatively recent innovation that, originated within the last century. So when it first emerged in the 1900s, artists of all genres, quickly adopted this new, very fast-drawing medium that showed versatility and potential beyond some other paints. So employing different kinds of acrylic painting techniques has resulted in some of the most well-known works on the market. So in 1901, there was a German chemist named Otto Röhm who first introduced acrylic resin to the world. So the resins were primarily intended for industrial use. It wasn't long before artists began experimenting with the synthetic medium. So artists started experimenting with this medium, and very soon, the very first water-based acrylic paints appeared in 1955. So in the latter half of the 20th century, a new wave of artists looking to explore different art movements like abstract expressionism and pop art, emerged on the scene. Acrylic paints naturally attracted the likes of American pop artist Andy Warhol and also, Robert Motherwell, British op artist Bridget Riley, and other kind of famous talents. So artists of all disciplines are really drawn to its versatility. Not only is it durable, but it's also has this kind of immediacy in its finish that other types of paint can't necessarily offer in the same way.
So there you can see, the finishing of the sort of second layer of paint. You see some beautiful, transparencies happen. I've got some close-in views, and start to understand how the painting is gathering more depth with each color that you add. So as I continue, I sometimes switch to more limited palette, maybe 3 colors. But if you're new to this, like I said, I would just keep up with this process, mixing up 1 color at a time until it becomes a little bit more like second nature to you, because using this process, and if you want to get kind of a really nice realistic quality to your paintings, this is really the best way to go. The important thing is that you're seeing that painting as a whole at all times. You'll see me start to just block in only shapes of light and dark here and there. I'm not just focusing on one area of the painting. I'm working all around to different parts of the painting at one time, so that essentially I'm pulling it all up at once. So, if I were in, a classroom and I was instructing you and I said, okay, you have to stop painting now, would you be satisfied with the entirety of the painting all at one time? So, I kind of try to think about it within my own self, is if someone asked me to stop, if I had to stop at any point, would I have addressed every aspect of that painting equally across the entire surface at any one time? That includes the background. People tend to forget the background and just, leave it empty or kind of like half filled. The background is just as important as any kind of subject that you're painting as well. So as you see me develop this over time, I'm going through all aspects of that piece and pulling out greater and greater depth and more detail and more kind of additional elements, and also creating some beautiful color tones with those transparent layers. So I'm using a lot of medium. So you saw that I pour it out onto the canvas, and I'm just dipping a little bit in the paint and a lot in the medium, and then I'm able to lay that over what color is underneath to get some really interesting qualities with that paint. So each layer that I add, you see more depth starting to come through with the color, and I'm working across the whole piece, trying to pull out the details as I go. I guess I'm sort of inventing color, but you get the sense. I think I made him a brown suit, right? But part of it is like the beauty in that transparency. I mean, acrylics are tough because they get dry really quickly, so I'm always like dipping in the water and the medium, and it helps me keep it more wet. I get frustrated with the texture of the canvas. The other thing about acrylic is that it has that, if you notice that it has that whiteness to it, so that's the water. And so it has a kind of milky quality, and so sometimes I get frustrated with that and have to I keep working it until it dries, it settles, and that whiteness goes away. Because even just if you just took water across the surface, and I can make it happen, but you see that there's a milkiness that happens that gets frustrating. And so, this is the part that I love, where I make new colors just by overlaying others. And I've really only got red, yellow, and blue on my palette.
of my pile of medium. A different kind of red yellow glue. It's Indian yellow. Indian yellow is really nice, it's super transparent already. And then the alizarin crimson, and then I have an ultramarine blue because the underpainting is more of a yellow blue, a Prussian blue. So if I add this sort of warmer blue on top, it changes the sort of tone of it a bit. And I always have about a million different brushes in my hand. Go back and forth. Each layer that I'm building, the color just gets more rich, and I'm building it up. I hate this canvas. Look at that flimsy thing. See that? The dent in this corner? Yeah, that's why I never buy store-bought canvases. But just like the littlest things, like I just go through and I put these little marks. You see, it's not like so that I'm seeing only the shapes of light and dark and not focused on the whole piece. Like this little line, all of a sudden he has wrinkles on his forehead. And I think that I see students too often being like, oh, that's a beautiful eye, I have to make it perfect, I have to finish the whole thing, and then before I move on to the next thing. Whereas you'll find you'll get more of a likeness if you think about what you're painting in terms of like abstract shapes, which is hard to get away from. I mean, I've been doing this for a lot of years, so. When I first did it, it was hard for me too, but I would make myself just use one color at a time through the whole process. One color, my medium, and a little bit of white. And then I'd make myself go across the whole thing, and if I had blue underneath, I'm putting yellow on top, I'm like, okay, where do I need green too? It's because then I'd see that color, like I didn't paint in green at all, and you see that green showing on. And so that's a way that you can do it to kind of get yourself used to the process, and then when you get more used to it, then you can kind of do it a little bit differently. Hey there, everyone. So that was really great working along with me for some bits of acrylic painting. So you start to see, how that process develops, and each layer that you build, pulls out greater and greater depth of color and really helps you to produce a really luscious, beautiful looking painting. So I urge you to continue with your work and complete it up to all the details at the very end. But I thank you for joining me on this process and getting a handle on how to really start to build those works up in layers and how to see what you can do with creating unique effects with acrylic paint. It can be a lot of fun using, transparent mediums and building up color gradually. So thank you for joining me, and I've had a lot of fun.